Love history? Subscribe and explore the stories that shaped our world.
To understand the monarch, one must first understand the perilous world into which she was born. Elizabeth Tudor entered the world in Greenwich on September 7, 1533, the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. But her arrival was not met with universal joy. Henry VIII was desperately hoping for a male heir, and he was so disappointed by the birth of a daughter that for a time Elizabeth was completely removed from the line of succession. Her childhood was defined by trauma and instability. When Elizabeth was just 2 years old, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed on charges of adultery and treason at the command of her father. Growing up in the shadow of a king famous for his revolving marriages and brutal treatment of his wives, Elizabeth learned early on that trust, intimacy, and marriage were rarely associated with safety. The tumultuous reigns of her half-siblings only deepened the danger. Following the brief rule of her younger brother, Edward VI, Elizabeth's Catholic half-sister, Mary I, ascended the throne in 1553. Mary sought to return England to the Catholic Church, earning the grim nickname Bloody Mary after more than 260 Protestants were burned at the stake during her reign. Mary's deeply unpopular marriage to King Philip II of Spain and her disastrous war with France, which cost England its last mainland territory of Calais, left the country weakened and fractured. For Elizabeth, her sister's reign was a time of extreme peril. As a Protestant and a potential rival to the throne, Elizabeth was viewed with suspicion and even imprisoned. She learned to be cautious, to hide her true feelings, and to navigate the deadly politics of the Tudor court. She knew that a single misstep could cost her her life. In 1558, Mary died, and Elizabeth came to the throne at the age of 25. The England she inherited was deeply divided by religion, threatened by powerful foreign rivals, and scarred by decades of domestic turmoil. As a young queen, the immediate expectation of her court, her parliament, and her people was that she would secure an alliance through matrimony and produce a male heir. But Elizabeth had other plans. She made a radical, unprecedented decision for a female monarch of her time. She would never take a husband. This decision was not merely accidental, it was a highly calculated strategy to preserve her sovereign power. In the 16th century, a woman's property, identity, and authority were legally transferred to her husband upon marriage. Elizabeth refused to be sidelined in her own kingdom, famously declaring, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." Furthermore, her sister's disastrous marriage to Philip of Spain had shown her the dangers of foreign entanglement. Marrying a foreign prince risked making England a satellite state, while marrying an English nobleman could spark jealousy and civil war among rival factions. Elizabeth also harbored a very real fear of childbirth, a highly perilous endeavor in the 16th century, where a queen's death could plunge the entire nation into chaos. This is not to say her life was devoid of romance. There is strong evidence that she deeply loved her childhood friend, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. But a scandalous public suspicion surrounding the mysterious death of Dudley's wife made their union politically impossible. Instead, Elizabeth transformed her unmarried status into a powerful mythology. She styled herself as the Virgin Queen, symbolically declaring that she was already bound unto a husband, the Kingdom of England itself. She became a master of public relations centuries ahead of her time. Using highly controlled imagery, she fashioned herself as both a beautiful, pure queen and a strong, masculine prince. Knowing that her body was a political liability, she used what became known as the mask of youth in her portraits, an idealized, ageless template that suspended reality and projected an aura of immortal strength. She dangled the promise of her hand in marriage to foreign royals, using her single status as a brilliant diplomatic tool to prevent rivals from uniting against her. However, the geopolitical landscape of Europe was rapidly deteriorating. By re-establishing Protestantism in England, Elizabeth became a primary target for the Catholic powers of Europe. In 1570, the Pope excommunicated her, deeming her a heretic and an illegitimate usurper, and even called for a holy war to depose her. The most formidable of her enemies was her former brother-in-law, King Philip II of Spain. By the 1580s, Habsburg Spain was the dominant military and political power in Europe, boasting a global empire that stretched from the Americas to the Philippines. For years, a Cold War simmered between England and Spain. English smugglers traded illicitly in Spanish colonies, and state-sponsored privateers, most notably Sir Francis Drake, raided Spanish treasure fleets, bringing immense wealth back to Elizabeth. At the same time, Elizabeth cautiously supported Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, who were fighting a bloody war of independence against Spanish rule. Philip feared that a free Netherlands would undermine his empire, and the presence of English troops there enraged him. The breaking point finally came in 1587. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth had imprisoned her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the focus of numerous assassination plots against Elizabeth. Bowing to immense pressure from her advisors, Elizabeth finally ordered Mary's execution for high treason. For Philip II, the execution of a Catholic monarch was the final insult. The die was cast. Philip began to seriously plan a massive invasion of England to overthrow the heretic queen and restore Catholicism. Philip's plan was audacious. A massive fleet would sail from Spain, travel up the English Channel, and link up with a battle-hardened Spanish army commanded by the Duke of Parma in the Netherlands. Together, they would cross the Channel on barges, land on English soil, and march on London. The invasion was initially delayed when Sir Francis Drake launched a daring preemptive strike on the Spanish port of Cadiz in April 1587, destroying dozens of ships and vital supplies. Drake boasted that he had singed the King of Spain's beard, buying England a precious year to prepare its defenses. But by July 1588, the Grande y Felicissima Armada, the great and most fortunate navy, set sail. Commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman with immense administrative skill but absolutely no naval experience, the fleet consisted of roughly 130 ships, carrying around 30,000 men and thousands of heavy cannons. When the Armada appeared off the coast of Cornwall on July 29th, warning beacons were lit across the English coastline. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham and Sir Francis Drake, sailed out from Plymouth to meet them. What followed was a running battle up the English Channel. The Spanish ships sailed in a tightly packed, highly disciplined crescent formation. Their traditional tactic was to fire a single volley, grapple the enemy ships, and board them for hand-to-hand combat. But the English ships were different. They were faster, sleeker, and armed with heavy, long-range cannons. Keeping the wind at their backs, the crucial weather gauge, the English bombarded the Spanish from a distance, refusing to let the Spanish soldiers board. The fatal flaw in the Spanish strategy soon became apparent. When the Armada anchored near Calais to wait for the Duke of Parma's army, they learned that Parma was not ready. His transport barges were blockaded in shallow waters by Dutch ships, waters where the deep-draft Spanish galleons could not safely enter to protect them. The invasion force was stranded. In the dead of night on August 7th, the English struck. They loaded 8 of their own ships with pitch, brimstone, and gunpowder, set them completely ablaze, and let the wind carry them directly into the anchored Spanish fleet. Terrified of these floating infernos, the Spanish captains cut their anchor cables and scattered in pure panic. The unbreakable crescent formation was shattered. The next morning, at the Battle of Gravelines, the English closed in. For 8 brutal hours, English cannons pounded the vulnerable Spanish hulls below the waterline. Blood flowed on the Spanish decks as their ships were battered, taking heavy casualties. Meanwhile, unaware of the victory at sea, Queen Elizabeth rode out to meet her land forces at Tilbury, dressed in ceremonial armor. In one of the greatest speeches in history, she roared to her troops, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." Defeated and pushed into the North Sea by a change in the wind, the Spanish Armada had no choice but to attempt a perilous journey home by sailing entirely around the rugged coasts of Scotland and Ireland. It was here that the true disaster occurred. What the English cannons had started, the weather finished. Massive Atlantic storms, driven by intense depressions, battered the fleeing fleet. With no anchors left to secure themselves, dozens of Spanish galleons were smashed against the unforgiving rocks of the Irish and Scottish coastlines. Thousands of Spanish sailors drowned, starved, or were executed by local forces upon washing ashore. By the time the remnants of the Armada limped back to Spain, nearly half the fleet was lost, and upwards of 15,000 men had perished. In England, the victory was viewed as a divine miracle. Medals were struck with the phrase, "God blew and they were scattered." Elizabeth's popularity soared to its absolute zenith. To commemorate this defining moment, the famous Armada portrait was painted, depicting the Queen as a beacon of calm between the English fleet and the tempest-tossed Spanish ships. Yet history is rarely as neat as the legends suggest. The war was far from over. The following year, in 1589, Elizabeth launched the English counter-armada against Spain, hoping to finish off Philip's navy. But due to disease, lack of supplies, and poor leadership, this expedition ended in a humiliating and costly defeat, nearly as disastrous as the Spanish attempt. Spain would quickly rebuild its navy, and the Anglo-Spanish War dragged on for another 15 years, ending only after Elizabeth's death. Furthermore, the English sailors who fought so bravely in 1588 were largely left unpaid, and thousands died of typhus and dysentery upon returning to port. But the psychological and historical impact of 1588 cannot be overstated. The defeat of the Spanish Armada vindicated revolutionary new English naval tactics, shifting the future of maritime warfare toward heavily gunned, agile ships. More importantly, it preserved Protestantism in England and proved that the island nation could defend itself against the greatest empire on earth. In the famous Armada portrait, Elizabeth is shown resting her hand firmly on a globe, her fingers stretching toward the Americas. This subtle gesture signaled the dawn of a new era. England would no longer be just a minor European state. Driven by the ambition that thwarted the Armada, England would begin to look across the oceans, funding colonial expeditions and trade missions, including the dark, lasting legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, which ultimately laid the foundations for the British Empire. Elizabeth I, the unwanted daughter, the political prisoner, the virgin queen who refused to share her power, navigated her country through its most dangerous hour. She modeled to the world that a woman could not only cope with power, but absolutely thrive in it, ushering in an era that history would forever remember as the Golden Age.